Amsterdam, 1639. The three separate Portuguese Jewish communities in the city have decided to merge into one. They have formed what they call Talmud Torah and are writing out the statutes for this newly formed community. Next on the list, establishing a treasurer, which they call a Gabai, for a specific charity funded by the community. It was Terra Santa, a charity to support the Jewish communities in Israel. Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Rossagini Vlogger, and on today's video I will be discussing 400 years of financial support for Israel through Terra Santa. This video is part of Project Middle East, a collaboration of history YouTubers making videos about historical topics on the Middle East. Be sure to check out all the other amazing videos that are part of this project. Sephardic Jewish migration to Israel increased greatly in the 16th century after the Ottoman conquests. But many Sephardic Jews settled all over the world. For the Sephardic Jews who had not settled in Israel, they felt an obligation to help support financially those who had settled in Israel. And I spoke further about this with my friend and colleague Tone Thielen, who has studied the records on Terra Santa in depth.
It was an obligation that was felt everywhere. Money for Terra Santa came from the whole of the diaspora. Jerusalem was felt to be the center of Judaism, and it was also felt that if people prayed in Jerusalem, they were closer to God and their prayers had more weight. So it was essential to keep this center of Judaism alive. Every community in the world felt the obligation to contribute. And it was no different in Amsterdam. The archives of the Portuguese Jewish community start in 1615, and from the first pages, all the archives of the first three communities, you see Terra Santa or Eretz Israel as an ongoing concern. So they took it very seriously.
Terra Santa was truly a worldwide charity and required a whole network of people to transport and convert the money. Even Dutch warships would sail in convoys with the ships carrying the money.
So the money was sent by ship from Amsterdam to a port in between. For the first 50 or 60 years of the communities in Amsterdam, we don't know which port in between that was, but it was probably a city in Italy or in the south of France. I have not found evidence that the money was ever sent overland. That carried more dangers. From 1670, we know through which ports the money was sent, and in the beginning that was Livorno, and then it was a few times Cairo, and the money that Amsterdam sent was in guilders. In Marseille, Livorno, or Cairo, or elsewhere, the money was exchanged for local currency, patakons, and one patakon was roughly 2.5 guilders. From the port in between, the money was sent by the same ship to Jaffa or another port, most probably Jaffa. And from Jaffa it was sent to the four cities of the Holy Land where there were sizable Jewish communities. That were Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. These shipments were remarkably safe. I've never seen recording that the money was late or that it was captured by pirates or anything like that. So how did they achieve that? Well, the Dutch had convoys. These were any number of ships sailing together under protection of one or two warships. The warships made sure that no one was captured and the money always safely arrived. I find that remarkable because this went on over hundreds and hundreds of years.
Something that makes this truly amazing are the records kept about the functions of the Terra Santa Fund. And these records give us the names of the people in Israel who received the funds, giving us one of the most in-depth looks into the people that made up the Jewish communities in Israel in the 17th and 18th century. We get many details: people's origin, deaths, the poor, orphans, widows, the pious, and more.
An extraordinary thing of the Amsterdam help was that it was earmarked. We don't know if that was the case in the first years, but from 1639 you find in the Amsterdam archives the so-called listas, lists of the pious and the poor of Jerusalem, Safed, etc. And behind each name it was noted what each person was supposed to get. Then there was some money for the general poor, there was some money for yeshivas, sometimes earmarked money from other communities outside of Amsterdam. These listas tell us names. We know of no other service in the whole wide world where we find so many names from Jerusalem. What's more, these lists reappear from year after year. And by looking at a series of lists, you see people coming in, receiving money for a number of years, then then dying. Then their widows received the money, they died, their children received the money, the children in turn became Chacham themselves. Just by looking at these lists, it's another way of doing genealogy.
The listas appear in the Eschamat books, a book of decisions by the governing board of the community called the Muhammad. These decisions related to all sorts of matters, and in fact, it is in these books that the Harem on Baruch Spinoza is also written. The item right after Spinoza's Harem, a lista for Terra Santa. But over time, there was a change in how things functioned, the flow of the money, and who received the money.
Amsterdam was one of the metropoles of the Sephardic world. It had an outsized influence based on its wealth, on its being part of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic provided structures in which this community could function safely and without interference of the government. That gave it a strong position in the wider Sephardic world. As the Dutch Republic became less wealthy and less influential, had less warships, etc., the might of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam also diminished. But it changed in two ways. The money was thereafter always sent to Constantinople, and they sent it to the Holy Land. And the second change was that before, the Amsterdammers supported all the Chachams and all the poor and all the widows and orphans of the Chachams. On some lists you might find as many as 40 to 50 rabbis mentioned, or their widows or their orphans, and they all received money from Amsterdam. But in 1728 it was decided that the poor who lived in Jerusalem would no longer be supported by Amsterdam. Those who received money continued to receive until they died, and then it was finished. So over time, in the listas, you only find the rabbis and the widows and the orphans.
So after 1728, we get a less nuanced look at these Jewish communities in Israel, but still the listas give us quite an interesting view into the community and are still quite genealogically useful. But they also tell us something important about the Portuguese Jewish communities.
The help from Amsterdam and from other communities as well, like London, Bordeaux, etc., was extremely important for the Holy Land because it returned reliably year after year. It allowed people to stay in Jerusalem who had otherwise have been forced out for lack of means of living, and it's contributed to the survival of Jewish communities in the Holy Land. Another system of providing money for the Holy Land was through emissaries or shaliachs. These were traveling religious people sent from the Holy Land abroad. They made tours through the whole of Europe and later through the Americas as well and North Africa. They returned to the Holy Land with whatever people wished to give. And the community in Constantinople gave out letters to these Shaliachs to prove that they were genuine. And some cities like Bordeaux and Livorno, they had societies called Terra Santa. They sampled the money and gave it to the Shaliach who arrived that year.
This fund continued throughout the years, only being interrupted by World War II, but then quickly being restarted in 1945.
Support for Terra Santa changed shape over the years. Like we saw, Constantinople took a central role, and in the 19th century, the sampling of money in the Netherlands was centralized and comprised both Ashkenazim and Sephardim. What put an end to all that was the Second World War, and then no money was sent for obvious reasons. After 1945, people started to give again. And this time it was an organization called Collective Israel Action, and it still exists. This constitutes over 400 years of continued support from the Jewish community in Holland.
Toon has been spending years working on indexing these records, but it is a lot, with at least 140 listas from 1639 to 1799. But once completed, it will be an invaluable tool for genealogists and historians to learn more about Jewish communities in Israel dating back to the early 17th century. Toon has already discovered some amazing things through his work.
What I found remarkable is that in some years, a lot of people died. And it shows here and there where you see Valleceo next to the name. And I suppose that those were years of extreme conditions. Some of these years I could not find in any other source. So there must have been epidemics in the Holy Land in years of which we don't know that they happened. So that makes it a nice source for medical history as well.
And through these records, we can quite easily see interesting histories related to these different communities throughout Israel. One such history relates to the Jewish community of Tiberias. After suffering destruction from wars and an earthquake during the 17th century, Tiberias was a dwindling community. A letter from the time written by a Rabbi Chaim Ventura described the community as being no more than 10 people until 1740. It was at this time that Zahir al-Umar, the Arab ruler of areas in northern Israel at the time, wanted to revive Tiberias, and part of his plan, he invited the Jews to resettle there.
And this was taken up by the family Abulafia. One Abulafia from Izmir and the sons came to Tiberias, and they also received support from Amsterdam from that year. This gives you insight into the history of that particular place.
And these records actually highlight a quite interesting part about studying history and genealogy. Sometimes the records and sources that give the best insight aren't going to be where you exactly expect them. Who would have thought that some of the best records giving some of the best insight into the Jewish communities of 17th and 18th century Israel would be sitting 4,500 kilometers away in Amsterdam? And if you'd like to learn about the origins of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, be sure to check out this video of mine right here. Thank you to my patrons, and especially Tane Summers, Catherine Dulles, Diane Finley, Heather Blakely, John Gilchrist, and Suzanne O'Connor.